Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the Introduction to Anime Studio Pro 11 for Animators webinar. My name is Michi Catanese. I'm the Product Marketing Manager here at Smith Micro. The presenter today is Mike Clifton. He's the original creator for Anime Studio as well as the lead engineer. I wanted to share with you about this webinar today. It's not going to be your basic beginners webinar for Anime Studio users. It's going to be geared more towards people who know a little about animation already and are currently using another animation software program. A few things to know before we get started. All attendees are muted today. We will have a brief question and answer session at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions, please type them in the questions window and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. Also, this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on our website. We'll try and get it up as soon as possible, no longer than 24 hours. Be sure to follow us on social media and we'll let you know when it's available. And I think that's about it. With that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Mike and let him get started.
Okay.
Unmute yourself.
I did.
Okay.
Is my voice coming through? Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
I had a little audio problem here, but I'm not hearing my own echo, so that's good. So as Michi said, this is not a webinar sort of for existing Anime Studio users, although you're welcome to watch. I'm going to be sort of giving an overview of the application, what it can do, how you use it. It's not exactly a tutorial because it's going to be sort of a high-level overview of capabilities rather than a step-by-step tutorial for how to create characters and animate them. But I think you're going to learn a lot about how the program works and the basics of what it can do. So first off, this is Anime Studio Pro.
Sorry, Mike, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'm getting a lot of comments that your sound is really bad. Do you want to go ahead and try and use the mic off your computer instead?
Actually, how's it sound now? Does it sound any better? There are two places that I could adjust my audio input, and now they're both set to my headset microphone, so I'm hoping it's
We're saying yes, it's better.
okay.
Thanks, everyone.
I had conflict between the two, the microphone input. So the audio is bad, but could you hear me at all? Or should I repeat that? Or okay, I guess I'll continue. Just briefly, I'm going to give an overview here of Anime Studio Pro, its capabilities, the basic way it works and organizes your projects and what you can do with it, rather than a step-by-step tutorial of how to create content and animate. But you'll see a lot of the basic ideas here. So starting off, this is the Anime Studio Pro interface. Along the side here, when you first start up with an empty project, you see a lot of vector drawing tools. So Anime Studio has all this full set of tools for drawing content. So you can draw basic shapes, like let's do a rectangle here, and then we can use add point tool to modify the shape of this rectangle. We can edit the position of points. So these are all just sort of vector editing tools, and we can do things like adjust curvature through points. So you can create basic shapes like this with the vector tools. This is a simple shape here. We have tools like the freehand tool that, if I use my Wacom tablet here, you can see that it's a pressure-sensitive drawing tool. So you can draw more complex shapes this way. We have a blob brush that lets us, let me make a really big blob. So it lets you sort of rough out shapes, and then these things consist of vector points that you can go in and edit. So as you can see, there are vector tools here to draw any kind of shape you could want. This is for drawing stuff in the program. We'll get into the case where you can import content that you've created somewhere else. I'm just going to briefly show the paint bucket too, so we can do things like fill areas with color. So once you've created some content, Let's create a little star or something here. Okay. Over on the right here, you have the layers palette. So this is an important concept for how you arrange your artwork. You can draw a complex object here, but you usually want to build it up with layers. So the layers palette is similar to layers in other programs like Photoshop and Illustrator, where you can create a whole set of layers. So here, we have a lot of layer types. I'm going to stick with vectors for the moment. So I created another layer on top of the first one, and I can draw another shape. So we have two shapes. Very simple right now. But with the layers palette, I can change which one is in front and which one is behind. So I'm moving the layers in front of and behind each other. So when you get into complex characters with arms and legs and faces, the layers palette is really an important way to sort of organize the back to front arrangement of complex artwork. One other thing I want to show here related to drawing is our brush system. So we have this complex set of brushes. We include a bunch with the program. You can create your own brushes, and there are brushes available for sale that people have created. Here's a little example of sort of a toon hair effect. So if I select this brush and I go back to the freehand tool, make the freehand a little bigger. When you paint with this brush, you get this sort of hairy effect. And we have other ones that are sort of look like natural brush strokes. So this one's a fat brush, but so here I can do things with vector artwork. A lot of times you get this very like solid kind of hard-edged look, and the brushes let you break that up for a more natural effect in your drawings. But it's still vector art, so I can go in and I can reposition, reshape these things. All right. So I'm not going to go into too much of the vector tools, just to give you an overview of that we have this full set of tools for creating artwork in the program. I'm going to show you a little bit now about very basic animation. So let's put that star back on. Okay, so we have a star with a brush effect. All right, so when you want to create animation, you look down here in the timeline. This is the bottom section of the application window. And Anime Studio uses an auto keyframing system. So to animate something, you just move to a different point in time. So here I'll go out to 30 frames, and I modify this object. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to translate layer 1 off to the side, and you see that a keyframe appears here in the timeline. This is the auto keyframing I was talking about. You don't have to say add a keyframe at this time. You just move the object and it happens. And so in between its initial state at frame 0 and the keyframe I added at frame 30, we get this automatic interpolation. So the object moves along that little path. And I can also rotate the object, so I can rotate the star like that, and I can resize it. And all these keyframes get added automatically. On the left side, these are the animation channels. So this is a layer translation. You can see I added a keyframe at 30. Layer scale and rotation, I added a keyframe at 38. And all those will interpolate automatically when I hit play. You can see here that there's a path for the translation keyframe, and I can edit that path directly by holding down the command key and clicking and dragging the path. So I can easily turn that path into a bit of a zigzag, and those keyframes appeared here in the timeline. So now the star moves in a little bit of a zigzag pattern. We can also look at their different properties for keyframes. So let's say let me select all of these translation keys. And if I right-click on them, I can choose different types of interpolation. So in this case, I'm going to choose noisy interpolation. And what that does, you can actually see it in the path. You can see that the line is all jagged. When I hit play, the star moves in a noisy pattern. So that's sort of some of the basics of how you set up keyframes. We'll get into more complex animation in a moment here. Actually, let's do it right now. The star and the rectangle are obviously very simple. I wanted to give you an idea of how to set up, how to draw, and where you see animation keyframes in the timeline. Let me do one other type of keyframe. So moving an object is one thing. You can also, with the vector tools, you can animate the shape of the object. So I'll move the star, change its shape. And I'm moving the points of the star around, and you can see now that there's a point motion channel that has appeared because I added a keyframe to the point motion. And I'll select all the points, and I'll adjust their curvature as well. So there are a lot of properties on vector shapes that you can animate. And now these, along with the translation and rotation, the position of the points and the curvature of the points is also animated. So when I hit play, all those properties are animated over time. So now let's look at something a little more complex. Basic shapes are one thing, but you want to be able to create complex characters. So I'm going to bring in an example of one before I show you how this is done. This is, I don't know how we pronounce this guy's name, Gruel. He's a monster that is included with the application. You can use him sort of as an example to see how he was created and animated, or you can use him in your own animations if you'd like. I'm going to play this back for a second and we can see what he does. So he moves around a little bit, blinks, smiles. I think he jumps to the side, steps to the side. So what you may have noticed here, in his body he has these little lines, and these are bones. So the way Anime Studio works is it's a lot like a 3D animation program where you can rig characters with bones, and then instead of moving the vector points around or redrawing every frame, you can use these bone rigs to animate the characters. So here I can let's zoom in a little bit. I can grab the bones in his arm, and instead of having to redraw the arm in different positions, I can just move it around. The tail. So it depends how you set up your character, what parts can be moved, but this one is pretty articulated. He's got arms and legs and even more complex parts that I'll get to in a moment. But this is what the bone system allows you to do. It allows you to create your artwork once and then animate it over time. So we can see here in the timeline that as you go along, there are a lot of bone keyframes. So this is bone angle, which is the most common way to animate bones. You rotate them over time. Bone translation and bone scale. And so if I go to some point in time, I can pose this character. So let's put his arms up and lean him back a little bit. And so that keyframe I just added will interpolate between its neighbors, and so it's very easy to create an animation over time. Now let's talk about how you set up a bone rig. I'm going to do a very simple example. So let's create a new file. This is going to be a rough example, but I like to do this because it shows just how easy it is to create and rig a character. So I'm starting with a vector layer, and I'm going to create a little bit of artwork. Let's reset some of the styles. Okay, so now I can draw. Remember, this is a rough character, so I should set a timer when I do this to see how quick it is. So there, I just drew out a rough vector character. Now I go to the layers palette and I add a new layer. In this case, I want a bone layer. Now bone layers are kind of like folders. they can contain other layers within them. So I'm going to drag the vector layer up into the bone layer, and you can see how it's indented. It's inside the bone layer now. Now, bones that I add to the bone layer can control any number of layers that are inside them. In this case, I have just one. But in the bone layer, now it's time to start adding the skeleton for this guy. So I'll just draw a few bones up the middle, and then I'll add a couple to this arm, a couple over there. And some bones down the legs, and that's it. So this tool here is the Manipulate Bones tool. And if I click that, I can now move the bones around, and you can see the vector artwork is already rigged and animates with the bone system. So this is just for testing. If I go into the timeline now, I can set keyframes. So I can go to frame 12, and I can move the arms, move the head, whatever I want. Go to another frame. So I'm just setting up a few keyframes of sort of random movement, but what I'm getting is an animation already. So if I scrub through the timeline, as I go past these keyframes, you can see the character moving with the bones. So it's a very quick example of how easy it is to rig a character. You can get into more detail. So at frame 0 here is sort of the setup frame. You can see these pill shapes around each of the bones. These are the strength regions. So to get a more refined rig, you can adjust the strength regions. So let's make it about the size of the artwork. So let's make the body one a little bit bigger, the head a little bigger. That's going to refine how the movement, what the region of influence for the different bones. So you're going to get a more detailed control over the different parts of the character. You can go in and you can assign vector points to individual bones. You can set up constraints so that a bone doesn't move backwards. Let's do that real quick. So this bone here, I'll set up angle constraints on this selected red bone. So I can, actually that's not the one I wanted. That would be fine too, but let's set it up on this one here. So it can bend that way, but I don't want the knee to bend backwards, so I set up the constraint to go there. So now when I try out moving this bone, when it reaches this constraint, these little lines, it can't bend any further that way, so that prevents the knee from bending backwards. So that's the kind of thing you would do if you're setting up a rig that you're going to animate for serious work rather than this quick little sketch. There's another interesting aspect to bones, and that's bone targets. So I'm going to add a couple more bones here. Let's add one by each foot. And I'm going to select this bone, and I'm going to make this bone that points down its target. And I'll explain, and this bone over here, its target is down below. Now target bones, a bone that has a target will always try and point to its target. So if I go out in time here, you can see that the feet now are trying to point to those targets, and if I move them far away, they still try and point to the targets. Let me adjust one thing here. The targets, I don't want to have any actual influence over the artwork, so I'm going to set their strength down to 0. And now when I move the character around, you can see its feet are trying to stick to that target. So that's inverse kinematics is what that's called. And rather than moving the position of the bones, you tell it where you want it to go, and then the program figures out how to get there. So this is really good for walking, holding on to things. So I can move the targets as well. So if I move the target around, I'm indirectly moving the foot. So that's bone target system, which is very handy. Another cool thing that bones are used for is what we call smart bones. So I have a sample file to start out here. So here I have a white rectangle that's in the vector layer here, and I have a bone layer, and the bone layer has several bones at the top. And these bones have been labeled, so you can give bones names. There's bend, color, line width, bumps, and pointy. And if I bring up our actions window, we call these actions, and I'll show you what they are in a second, but notice that they match the names of the bones. There's a bend, action, color, line width, bumps, and pointy. And an action is sort of a miniature timeline of its own. So if I look at the bend action, the timeline has turned blue. It indicates we're in an action timeline instead of the main timeline. But in this action timeline, you can see that the bend bone moves from one side to the other, and the vector shape bends from its original shape down and up. And the other actions have similar animation. So what does this all mean? What it means is the bones now have a little animation tied to them. So the character I showed you before, this guy, the bones move the artwork directly. In this case, smart bones can control any animatable property that you want. So if I move the bend bone, the shape bends. If I move the color bone, it's been set to cycle through a few different colors. The line width does this random line width animation. The bumps create bumps in the shape, and the pointy makes the bumps pointy or smooth. And these can all be combined. So I can bend, change the color, change the line width, make it bumpy or not, and make it pointy or not. So smart bones are a way to sort of define your own properties and control them with bones. So the bones you can sort of think of as custom control dials that you add to your rig. So let's go in time. I can set keyframes, and these are just regular bone keyframes like we were animating the little blue character. Let's adjust the color, line width, make it bumpy, and then eventually pointy, and bend back the other way. So with a few adjustments of these control dials, I now have a complex shape that bends, bumps grow out of it, it changes color, and does all this stuff. Instead of having to move the individual points around, I just adjust the dial. So a smart bone is a great tool to use when you have some little clip of animation or a complex movement that you think you're going to do over and over again, but you don't want to have to animate it over and over again. You can create a smart bone that will do it once, and then you can go in and adjust it. So this is a good illustration of what smart bones can do, but let's see how they're used in practice. So I'm going to import another character that we include, Bigsby the rabbit. So Bigsby, if we look close, we could see that he has bones in his arms and legs, just like my character did. And I can go in and I can animate those. And that moves his body around. But he also has a set of smart bones off to the side here. So the smart bones were set up by the creator of this character to do things like turn his head side to side. So a head turn can be sort of a complex animation, especially in 2D, because this fur on one side of his head is visible here, but if I turn the other way, it sort of goes behind his head, and his eyes and nose have to sort of appear and disappear and change shape. So a head turn, takes a good amount of work to create, but if you assign it to a smart bone, all you need to do is create it once, and then you can turn his head at any time. And I can adjust his happiness. You can see his expression changing and his mouth opening and closing. And all these things, again, can be combined. So I can open his mouth and turn his head, have him blink. If you look at the hand here, the fingers can open and close with this controlled bone. And that's also quite a complex little animation that you wouldn't want to have to do every single time he opens and closes his hand. Set it up with a smart bone. So here, let's play back his animation. So it's kind of interesting to watch as he animates. You can watch the smart bones sort of turn. So this is the head turn here. Watch it turn. And of course, these things don't show up in your final export, but you can turn them off in the program too. If you don't want to see the bones while you're doing a preview, you can just look at the artwork. You might also notice that the way his legs stretch, squash and stretch. So that's an important property of animation. They also have targets like I created for my rough character. But in this case, his legs have squash and stretch properties set to them so that when I move the target, the leg not only tries to reach the target, but it's able to stretch a bit. So you can set that limit. So here I've gone beyond the limit, so the leg is stretched to its maximum and can't reach it anymore. But in this range, you get a nice squishy movement to his limbs. I've been showing, this guy is created with vector artwork. I've been showing a lot of vector artwork. I also wanted to show what you can do with images. So let me close up some of these. Maybe I should have left them open, hopefully. We'll see if we get questions about those. But I'm going to bring up Photoshop here. So here's a robot that was painted on actual paper and scanned. So this is an actual picture. And then in Photoshop, it was broken up into layers. So here we can see, let's hide some of these. Left leg, right leg, left arm, torso, neck, head, antenna, and right arm. So these layers were created in Photoshop, and the reason it was broken up from a single image into a layered image is so that we can animate these parts individually. So let's go back to Anime Studio. And in the File menu, you can import an image. You can import a variety of still images, PNGs and JPEGs, as well as Photoshop files. We particularly like Photoshop and PNG because of the alpha channel. For animating, you often want the background removed, and you don't want like a picture directly out of your camera because there's a lot of background information. But if you can trim out the background, it's a lot more useful for animation. So here I chose this robot PSD Photoshop document, and I say open. When you import a Photoshop document, you get the option to import a composite image or the individual layers. In this case, I want the layers, so I'll choose individually. And I get in Anime Studio a group layer, which is another type of layer, and then a bunch of image layers inside it. And as we can see, these are the same layers that we saw before in Photoshop. The left leg, right leg, left arm, torso, neck, head, antenna, and right arm. So now I can take these layers, and let's take the right arm. I can move this layer individually from the rest of the character. So I can move it, but I can also rig it with bones. So instead of going through that process again, I have the robot already rigged. Let me bring him up. So this is the robot, same image layers from the Photoshop file, but I've set up a bone layer and I've added bones in here. So let's hide most of the image layers. Here are the bones that I've put inside the robot's body. Let's show the images again. Now with images, there are a couple ways. You can do this with vectors too, but the blue character I had before, he was all squishy and bendy as I moved the bones around. In the case of the robot, some of the bones control the robot's layers as cutout animation. So here you can see when his head turns, let's go ahead a few frames. When his head turns, it stays as a solid piece, his neck as well. The arms and legs, however, if I zoom in a little bit, were set up to be flexible. So when I move his arm, you can see that it bends. And the legs were even more flexible. They have a lot of bones in them so they can get all bendy. So you can take images and you can make them all bendy. You can animate them. Because of the nature of the separate layers, when I move his arm, it doesn't cause his body to get all squished up. The body and the arm are independent because they're separate layers. So let's take a look at the animation for this guy. He just moves around a little bit and shows the rigging of images. If you look at his antenna, that's kind of an interesting feature of bones in Anime Studio. You see how it kind of wiggles side to side. That's a little bit of automatic animation that was added. These bones were set up with bone dynamics, which is sort of gives them a springy physics-based behavior. So when he tilts his head, the antenna sort of follows and springs along after it. So I'm not quite done with the Photoshop documents here. We've got our layers. Now what if you want to make a change? So let's keep this robot open and let's go back to Photoshop. Let's say I want to color his eyes red, so I can use the Photoshop's paint bucket tool and color his eyes. If I save in Photoshop and then I go back to Anime Studio, you can see that it picks up the change immediately. So now I've got the updated image in Anime Studio. It doesn't change the animation because the animation is Anime Studio's part. The image is Photoshop's part. So Anime Studio references that image and keeps track of any changes. We can also do things like, let's say we add a new layer here above the torso. Let's call this layer heart, and I'm going to try and give the Tin Man a heart. Oh. So I added a new layer. I'll save that. And when I go back to Anime Studio, you see that that layer appears. If we look here, there's the heart layer right above the torso. And there's the little heart. So Anime Studio tracks not only changes to pixels, so you can repaint parts of the character, but also new layers, so you can adjust, add new content to your Photoshop document after importing it, and you'll get those changes. Okay, I'm going to talk about frame-by-frame animation. Anime Studio for a long time has been all about rigging and setting up bones and creating sort of puppet-like characters that you can animate, and this saves a lot of time, and we've got a very powerful bone system, constraints, smart bones, all this kind of thing. But we've also had people ask about frame-by-frame animation. There are certain effects that are difficult to achieve with bones, or maybe you want the more traditional feel of hand-drawn frame-by-frame animation. And so this is actually a new feature in Anime Studio Pro 11. And I'm going to show you the basics of how to do frame-by-frame animation. This is a little more labor-intensive, so I'm going to do a sort of a rough example here, but it'll give you the idea of how it works. So frame-by-frame is another layer type in Anime Studio. So I've got a blank document, and I'll create a frame-by-frame layer. And just name it box. So in this layer, let me see, I need wider brush. Okay. I'm going to create just a little cube. So and a little ground line. So I'm just using the vector tools. This is the freehand tool, but I just drew a little rough object. There are a few controls that appear here only for frame-by-frame layers. And this is add frame, or new frame, delete frame, and duplicate frame. This field here sets how often you want a new frame. So let's go into the animation a little bit and we'll add a new frame. So now the old one went away and I have a new blank frame to draw on. A useful thing when doing frame-by-frame animation is the onion skin feature. So I'm going to turn on the onion skins. This shows me sort of a transparent view of the previous frame. In the timeline, I get a little indicator here of the onion skin frame while I'm drawing on this new frame. Onion skins is sort of a term from traditional hand-drawn animation when you see sort of tracing paper. So onion skin paper is sort of a thin paper that you can see through for tracing, and that's what we're doing here. So it lets me see what I drew before. So I know now I'm drawing the same cube a little bit lower. And let's add another frame, and I'll draw it a little bit lower. And now we're going to, on the next frame, we're going to hit the ground. So the box is going to squish it a little bit. Let's bend the sides inwards. Sorry, I'm concentrating on my incredible drawing skills. All right, so there's just a few frames of frame-by-frame animation. I'm going to turn off the onion skins here so we can see the final result. So the cube falls down and squishes. That's a real quick, rough example, but let's cycle that a few times. So this is a very different look from the rigged bone animation. And I'm going to show you a couple examples of people who have spent more time than I just did here, what you can create with frame by frame. So here's a kind of quick one, but it has a nice look to it. You can see that splash of a water droplet. And if we look at a few of those frames in there, if you look from one frame to the next, they're really quite different. And that's the kind of thing that's difficult to achieve by animating points or animating with bones, is when something is changing its shape rapidly. So like water, or here we have an example of some fire. So it's really nice for a hand-drawn look or effects that really change from one frame to the next. There's one more I'd like to show you. This one here is actually, I don't have it here. Oh, I do. It's included. So I'm going to import this scene. I'm sorry. I don't have that one. Maybe we'll get back to it. Okay, let's see. I showed onion skins with frame by frame. The next thing I was going to show was a little bit more advanced features in the timeline. So let's bring in Gruel again. I showed you this guy earlier about basic the way bones work. He also has some nice smart bones set up for adjusting his head turn and his mouth and his eyes going side to side. But what I wanted to show you here was the motion graph mode in the timeline. So here we see the default view shows channels and keyframes. We also can look at a motion graph. So let me select a bone, one of these bones in his arm, and if I enable that in the graph, what you can see here are the keyframes for that bone, but it's also a graph of how it moves over time. So in this section, we can see that the arm isn't moving. The line is pretty much flat. And then it moves, bends upwards over the course of a few frames, is flat again, and moves down. So a graph is a way to sort of conveniently adjust the movement. It's time on the horizontal axis and value vertically. So if you've used something like this in other animation programs, this is going to look kind of familiar. We can move the keyframes not just in time, but now we can adjust the values at the same time. And if I set different kinds of interpolation, here's the noisy interpolation I used before, you can see that in the graph. Or actually, in this case, I wanted to show you Bezier interpolation. Bezier interpolation really depends on the motion graph because now this keyframe has additional handles. Let's set all these to Bezier actually. So all these keyframes now have handles where I can go in and I can adjust the timing and the curvature of the interpolation using Bezier handles. And this just gives you more control over how Anime Studio interpolates from one value to the next. You could do a similar thing by adding a whole bunch of keyframes in between, or you could use these handles to sort of have the ultimate control over the shape of these curves. All right, the content library. I've been importing a bunch of characters here to show you some of the things that you can do. I'm going to bring up that library now. Anime Studio ships with a bunch of content that you can browse. I click this button here. That was kind of quick. This is the content library. And we have a variety of categories. We have characters, props, images that you can use for backgrounds. Let's look at a couple of these. So the Anime Studio 11 characters, we have a dragon, gorilla, samurai. You can bring these things in just by dragging them from the library. So if I want to bring in a dragon, actually I'll just bring him in, and let's go to images. Let's put a dragon in a field. Okay, so I brought in a couple things from the library, and I'll put the field behind the dragon, of course. And I think he's animated, yeah. So there's a lot of content there that you can work with, a lot of characters, a lot of user-created animations that you can sort of study to see how people build their characters and their scenes. Another thing I want to show you, well, and you can add your own content to the library. So some people, studios maybe that have characters and backgrounds that they want to share among all their animators will add them to the library, and then you can just reuse things as you go. I'm going to show you by way of the library. Let's just clear up some of these documents. Okay, I'll create a blank document. And we have audio in here. So where do we have audio? Oh, of course, the music icon. Sorry. we have a few sound effects that are just sort of for fun. So I'm going to look here, and this is an audio clip of somebody yelling for help. I don't think that's going to play through the webinar, but it's not really important to hear it. The idea is here that we can import that into the project. So you can import audio from the library, or you can import your own audio. We also have an audio recording window that you can record directly in the program. But now I have this audio layer that shows up, and you can see the waveform of the audio in the timeline. If you import multiple audio clips, the sequencer view is a nice way to sort of position the audio in time. I'm going to leave it here at the beginning for now because just for what I'm going to show. So I imported some audio from the library. I'm also going to import a mouth shape. So I'm going to show how lip syncing works. Under the props, we have some mouth sets. So these are example ones you can work with. I'm going to take this basic mouth and I'm going to import that into the project. And I'll close the library. This is another layer type that we haven't talked about yet. This is called a switch layer. And a switch layer is sort of like a group. It contains a bunch of layers within it. But the concept with a switch layer is that it only shows one of its sublayers at a time. So for mouths, you can use them to create different phonemes. So different mouth shapes for different sounds. Switch layers are sometimes used for eyes that you want to just blink by changing the shape of the eye, or different head shapes, different hand shapes. So in this case, it's mouth shapes. And we have a lip syncing system built in. If I double click this layer, I bring up the properties for that layer. And a switch layer has a particular set of properties for lip syncing. So I can select what audio source I want to lip sync to. I'll choose this help, please help audio layer that I imported. And I'm going to just click OK. Anime Studio has a built-in automatic lip syncing system, but when I click OK, we can see in the timeline a bunch of keyframes have appeared. And actually, if I hover over these keyframes, it'll show me what mouth shape is showing at any particular time. And when I hit play, again, I don't think you're going to hear the audio, but the mouth, we don't have to worry about the audio really for the purpose of the webinar, but the mouth now is moving with the underlying audio. So that's all it takes to do quick lip syncing in Anime Studio. You can go in and you can edit these keyframes if you need to make a little adjustment. But that's you can use the built-in mouths, or you can create your own mouths if they have these same mouth shapes to go with the audio, and then we can lip sync your mouth to any audio. There's something I wanted to show real quick. Another layer type is particle layers. So you can create a particle layer. I'm going to use one of our built-in effects. These scripts are kind of like plugins. We ship with a bunch of them with the program. Users can write their own add-ons. I'm going to use one in particular right now, a particle effect, sparkles. So if I use this, it lets me choose what color I want for the sparkles. Let's make them red and easy to see. And when I hit OK, in the layers palette here, a new particle layer was added. And if I press play, you can see that it just creates these sparkles that kind of glow and fly around. I can move this layer down here, and then at another point in time I can move it up and then down. And as I play it back, you can see that the particles are flying out of this particle layer, and some of them are sort of drifting off behind. So particles are a good way to create sort of magical sort of effects like this, or fire, smoke, rain. We have built-in scripts for a variety of those, so we have automatic rain and snow and smoke and explosions. You can create your own. Sometimes people use particle effect or the particle layer with characters as the particles, and you can quickly create a crowd of characters. So I have a few advanced topics I can go into, but we're just sort of running out of our hour or two. I don't know if I should go into some of those or if we should look at questions.
We do have some questions, Mike. This might be a good opportunity to have everyone type in their questions if they have any, and we can try and get to them. We probably have another, let's see, we're getting close on time. Maybe show one more advanced feature and then we'll hit the questions, and we might go over just a few minutes if that's okay with everyone out there. We apologize.
Okay, this is one I wanted to show anyway. This is a relatively new feature called point colors. So this is a vector layer, just a vector blob kind of thing, and it's colored gray. But what we can do is if I select some points on this shape, with the point color tool, I can choose a color, and that, oops, let me select both of those. I can go in and I can assign a color to those points. So let's make these ones green, click OK. I can select some other points, and I can use that picker, or I can use the color palette over here. If I alt-click on a color, I'm assigning a color there. Let's assign red here. And what you can see is I'm building up sort of a complex gradient inside this shape. So now, if I reshape this, the colors adjust with the shape. So again, it's a way to create a more complex effect than just a solid filled vector shape. You get a nice control over a gradient. There's some more complex things you can do. Here's it can handle holes and things, so I can select a few points and assign red to those, and so it doesn't really care about what your object is shaped like. There are tools like the gradient mesh and Illustrator don't work well with holes, but this one handles it fine. Here's an interesting use case. So here I have a character in a dark space, but I have a vector shape that's just a simple line that has point colors assigned. So if I take this shape and I stretch it out, I can get a sort of spotlight effect using point colors. So I can adjust the strength of these as well, so I can make more light appear, and I can animate this so I can change the direction of the spotlight and set the strength down smaller so it becomes a narrow light, and then pan up here. And then as I go through the timeline, you can see that this lighting effect moves over time. And so this is done with the point color system. So that's just a brief look at it, but it allows you to sort of control color, opacity, and gradient effects across a vector shape. There's a lot of sort of complex effects you can get that way. Just a quick look at that.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Mike. All right. Let's go ahead and get into some of the questions. The first one that came in says, can you hide and then redisplay an item on the timeline? When you go to answer that, Mike, I'm wondering if you showed animated shape ordering.
I didn't show that. I could show. I was muted. I didn't show animated shape ordering. I can show that as well. First, the question was about hiding and showing. So yes, you can do that. A quick shape. Let's animate it. It rotates and it moves. So that's, basic rotation and movement. But during during its movement, I can also hide it. So if I go again, double-click the layer and make it not visible, So a new channel has appeared here that's the layer visibility channel. And over here, the shape is red, which indicates it's not visible during this period of time. But if I go ahead again, and I double click and add a new keyframe, I'm going to just add a few keyframes in the layer visibility channel. The red areas are going to tell us where this layer is not visible. So when I play it back, you'll see that it disappears and reappears, disappears and reappears. We still see the vector shape here because you can still animate the properties or the points, but during the final output, it's going to completely disappear during the red sections on the timeline. Was somebody interested in animated shape order as well?
No, but just since we were talking about hiding and showing images, I thought maybe you could touch on that since you didn't cover that earlier.
Yeah. Let me see. Okay, yeah, so here we have a single layer with 3 shapes in it. And are these animated? They're not. But what I can do is I can take one of these shapes and I can move it across the other one. So you see the red dot moves in front of the blue box. But what if I want to have it move behind this part? So what I need to do is, in the layer settings, I can say animated shape order. I have to turn that on for this layer. And then I can select the red shape and say lower to back. So now it's going to go behind the blue shape here. So during this part of the animation, it's in front of the blue shape, and this part it's behind. And you can see a keyframe has been added here in the shape order channel. So this allows you to create more complex effects like this one, which is what I initially brought up. This is a smart bone here for the head turn. And you can see that one of the things that happens during the head turn is the shapes change order. So these big floppy ears, when the character moves to the side, this ear should go behind the head, this one should be in front, and the eyes should be ordered a certain way. When I turn the other way, this ear goes behind, this one's in front, and the eyes are ordered a different way. So you can animate things, the shape order manually on the timeline, or you can set it up in a SmartBone action so that every time you adjust this SmartBone, the order of the shapes can be controlled by the SmartBone. And these 2 shapes are also ordered just as sort of a little test thing here. As the SmartBone moves, the green rectangle goes in front of and behind the brown one. And maybe I should mention this. I can't really show a detailed thing, but what we've been looking at here is sort of a 2D setup, but Anime Studio really has a 3D environment. So if I just insert a simple 3D shape and then I look from outside the camera, you can see that, let's hide the cube. This character is flat, but things can actually be arranged in 3D. So here I inserted a simple cube that I can move around, and you can turn the camera around in 3D. You can animate camera angles and things to create complex 3D effects. Even though most of the artwork and the bone setup might be 2D characters, they can move around in 3D environments.
Great. On that note, Mike, we did have a few questions about 3D and Poser. Let me find them really quickly. Someone is wondering if you can import and movement of 3D objects from Poser. Another person is asking, sorry, I wasn't prepared for these right now. What are the possibilities or options with Poser models? So if you can touch on that a little bit, the 3D objects in general, like the file format, and then what we can do with poser models, that would be great.
Sure. I didn't prepare an example, so I don't know that I'm ready to show that at the moment, but what we can do is in the File menu, Import, you can choose a poser scene. So if you're a poser user and you've created a scene in Poser, you can import that into Anime Studio. It will come in with all its animation and models and things. You can see the animation in Anime Studio. You can move the Anime Studio camera around the poser scene. You can also animate that poser object as a layer, so you can position it in Anime Studio's 3D space. We have a window for poser parameters that lets you control the animation of your poser character, so you can fine-tune it in Anime Studio. We sort of recommend that you do your poser animation in Poser, but if you want to tweak things, like you can move a character's arms and legs and stuff in Anime Studio as well. Anime Studio can also import OBJ files, so if you have OBJ 3D files, which most 3D programs can create, you can import those into Anime Studio as well.
Okay, great, thank you. Here's a quick question. You did touch earlier on being able to use PNGs and PSDs. Someone is asking about Illustrator files, whether you can import or export them.
You can import Illustrator files. We actually recommend SVG files instead, because SVG is an open format and other programs besides Illustrator can create that, and our SVG support is honestly better than our Illustrator support. But Illustrator can export SVG, so that's not a problem. So yes, you can import SVG files. They appear as vector layers in Anime Studio that you can animate and rig, just like vector objects you create yourself. We don't have a vector export function. You can export Flash, but that's not, these days that's not as, doesn't see as widespread use. But you can definitely import SVG files.
Great, okay, thanks. Let's see, can you set up color palettes for each individual character?
Yeah, I didn't go into that, but that's our style system. So if the style palette is where I've been choosing fill and stroke color and line width. I'm going to expand this to the advanced mode. You can create new styles. So if I create a style and I call it skin for my character, and I choose the color that I want for my character's skin, and I can choose a line width and an outline color as well. Now if I start creating shapes, so let's just do this. So if I just create some random shapes, these are all separate shapes. But if I go in later and I edit the style and I decide I want a different color for the fill, all those shapes that use that style will change. And I can adjust the line width for that style, or even apply a brush, edit various properties. And anything that uses that style will inherit those properties. So if I want this shape to not, I can turn off the skin style for this particular shape and it'll go back to its own style. So that's sort of how you create your own custom colors for characters. There's also the swatches here. All of these are included with the program, but you can import an image or set up your own custom swatches for your characters that you can pick colors from directly.
Okay, great. Let's see, next one. So we actually have quite a few questions, Mike, so maybe if you can keep it short so we don't keep these people too much longer than than we already are. Here's one that says, can you combine cutout and vector in one character?
Yes, you can mix any kind of layers inside of them. Sorry, microphone was off. Yes, the answer is yes. Sorry, microphone was off. Yes, the answer is yes. You can combine vector layers, image layers, particles, anything within a bone layer.
Okay, great. Let's see. I don't think you need to mute yourself, Mike. I think the echo stopped when you did something on your computer. Let's see. When you were talking about Photoshop files, someone's asking if you can use Photoshop 7. He doesn't use CS.
I don't actually know the answer to that. Photoshop, they're pretty good about maintaining file compatibility, so I wouldn't be surprised, but if you could, but I don't know the answer for sure.
Okay, some of these are really complicated. I don't know if you could give a quick answer to this, but someone's wondering how you add special effects like explosions.
We include some of those, so particle effects, you just choose the explosion effect, and then the explosion's pretty nice. It doesn't preview as much, but so some of them are built in. We also have some in our library under the effects category. You can use some of these built-in ones, fires and crowds and smoke and things like that.
Okay, I don't know. I'm not familiar with the answer to this, but maybe you will be. Someone's asking if these images and animations can be imported into Avid Media Composer and Pinnacle Studio.
Yeah, so when we export, you can choose what kind of format you want. So you can export an image sequence or various movie formats. So anything that can import an image sequence of PNG or Targa files or QuickTime or MP4 files should be able to import what Anime Studio creates. Anime Studio, this is sort of about the effects question from before. Anime Studio can also import movies. So if you have an explosion that's in a movie file, you can import that into Anime Studio and combine it with the rest of your project.
Okay, actually, we have someone asking about being able to import Manga Studio files, turn them into vector files.
So you can, when you import an image file, we do have an auto trace function that I didn't get into, but you can trace an image file to create a vector file from it. We don't import Manga Studio files directly, but Manga Studio can export PNG and JPEG, and we can bring those in and trace them.
Actually, we have quite a few people using our other software products in this webinar, which is great to see. Someone's asking, how well does Anime Studio work with Motion Artist for combining animation for each program?
Motion Artist can import Anime Studio projects, so you can, if you want to create a more complex animation in Anime Studio, Motion Artist doesn't do bones and things, but you can bring in a rigged character into Motion Artist and combine it with other elements.
Great. Okay, when using onion skin, can you copy the previous layer instead of redrawing the object entirely and then edit as required?
Yes. So here in the cube I was drawing, for this layer, I was just adding new frames, but I can also duplicate a frame and then use the vector tools to modify the shape of this. Just a real quick thing here. So I duplicated a frame and then I modified it. So you can add a blank frame or duplicate a frame.
Okay, a few more questions here. Do you have an Animatic and Anime Studio Pro content library? I don't know what that means exactly.
Yeah,
are we
I'm not
able
quite
to
sure.
Are we able to create animatics? Is that what they're saying? I don't know.
I don't quite know what they're asking. Sometimes people will create an animatic, which is sort of a rough animation. Sometimes it looks like a slideshow. Sometimes it's a little more detailed, and they may import that movie and sort of put it in the corner here where they can use it as a reference while they animate their main character. We don't include any animatics because that sort of depends on what your story is and what you're creating. But you could put an animatic of your own into the library and then import that.
I know a lot of people are using Motion Artist for animatics as well, so maybe that's a better solution. Okay, we still have quite a few questions. Let's see, there's some long questions here. Try and find one that's quick. So there's another question about importing 3D images. So I think it's from SolidWorks or a CAD file. So it does import OBJ files for 3D, right?
That's right.
Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, it imports OBJ. It supports texture maps and material properties, so you can bring in those. It doesn't have the 3D renderer in Anime Studio is rather simple, so it renders with sort of a Toon kind of look. You can do shading, but you can't do very complex lighting.
Okay. We do have quite a few questions about export options, file formats, let's see, things like that, system requirements. This is all on our website. We do have a tab under, I think it says features, but if you go there, it will show a whole list of everything that you need to know about all that. I wish we had time to go over all that for you, but we just don't. Let's see. Can you edit and layer and import a JPEG character image in Anime Studio?
So we do have a magic wand tool for if you import an image that doesn't have an alpha channel. So JPEGs don't support alpha channels. So if you have a drawing, we have a tool that lets you sort of, with a magic wand, remove the background. I would generally recommend using an image editor like Photoshop because it lets you fine-tune the details. But we can remove backgrounds, and so then you could import multiple JPEGs and layer them that way.
Okay. We do have some more questions. It looks like we're not going to be able to get to them all. It's already 15 minutes over the regular time. There are a few questions here where I will email these people directly the questions that they have. Let's see. Let me see if there's one more. Someone is asking about a trial version of the software. We do have a trial version on our website. I believe it's a 30-day free trial. If you want to give it a go, you can do that. I think that's about it. All these other questions are going to be really lengthy to answer, and we really apologize that we cannot get to them all. But we are going to go ahead and wrap up. Just really quickly, if you want more information on Anime Studio, here's the URL on your screen, anime.smithmicro.com. For more information on our webinars and to watch this recording, go to mysmithmicro.com/webinars. We do have a forum. It's an official forum for Anime Studio, and that's at lostmarble.com. Lots of animators there asking questions, sharing information, that kind of thing, so it's a great resource. Also, make sure you follow us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter. We also are on Instagram. If you want to get the latest information, you can follow us and get that there. And then we also do have our email list. If you want to sign up to receive our emails, you'll get all the latest information. We also have educational pricing. If you are a teacher or a student, you can go to our website and follow us there. So that's about it. We want to thank you for joining us today. We hope you got some questions answered and learned about Anime Studio, and we hope that it is a possible resource for you in the future. So thank you, Mike, for your help today. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we will see you in the next webinar. Bye-bye.